All right, moving on to section 4. We're looking at observational studies and sample strategies. So we're going to be looking at how we're going to be gathering up information for our different studies that we want to do. Okay, so first off is observational experimental. We've talked about this briefly. So if you're observing and collecting data, this would be an observational study. If you're manipulating the situation in any way, adding or subtracting something, then it would be an experimental. So if you're just looking at it, it's observational. If you are doing something with it, it is experimental. Okay, so we're going to be looking at kind of more of the observational than anything else. So let's say we have the following. Suppose an observational study tracked sunscreen use and skin cancer. And it was found that people that use sunscreen are more likely to get skin cancer than people who do not use sunscreen. Okay? So, my question is, does this mean that sunscreen causes cancer? Okay? Take a second. Think. Based on this, my personal thing that I would say about this would be that no, it wouldn't, because the way you get skin cancer is usually that you're out in the sun, and people that use sunscreen are more likely to be out in the sun than those that do not. So, if you look at people that use more sunscreen, they're probably out in the sun more often than those that do not use sunscreen. Okay, all right. So that would be. So I would not agree with that question. I wouldn't say that there's a connection there. All right, confounding variables. So confounding variables have a few other names: the lurking variable, confounding factor, or confounder, if you want to call it that way. Basically, it's a variable that has an association with both the explanatory and the response variables that we are looking at. So in this case, sunscreen use and cancer, skin cancer, mostly. So sunscreen use and skin cancer, there is a confounding variable in this. And that confounding variable that is attached to both of them is the sun. So being out in the sun is the reason, or is another possible reason why people could get sun cancer, because those that are out in the sun will be using more sunscreen, and in turn are more likely to get skin cancer. So that sun would be your confounding variable. It's attached in kind of both of them. Okay. So because we have these confounding variables or these lurking variables, something that's connected to both, we can't always draw our conclusions that the explanatory variable and the response variables are connected. Okay, because it could be this confounding variable that is drawing that connection for us, and that confounding variable might be the real reason. So we just have to look out for those. It's just something that could pop up now or later. So let's say we've got our observational study, and so we're going to be looking and gathering data. There's two different ways of looking at this. We've got our prospective study, which is a study in which you're gathering information in real time. So as you are watching people run races, or as people are scoring runs or points or whatever it is that you're looking at, as something heats up or cools down, those are perspective studies. You're looking at something as it happens in real time. Now, if you're going through the record books, if you're going through data from the 1900s, from the 1800s, from the 1700s, that's a retrospective study, okay? Because you're looking at something that happened in the past and seeing if you can draw connections from something in the past, okay? So those are two different. So prospective study means you're looking at it at the now. Retrospective is looking at it in the past, which if you ever use the word retrospective, you're always looking back at something. So that's kind of a way that you can help remember that. Okay, so samples and census. So sample and census are two different things. Every 10 years, the U.S. does a census, which is finding out how many people approximately are in the U.S. And so what a census is a counting of every person in a population to gather some sort of information. So if we want to find, let's say we're talking about an election and we want to find who's going to win a certain election, doing a census will get the exact number, okay? Because you get every single person in the population and you get their opinion on it, and that would make it a census, okay? The counting of the people in the U.S., you're counting everybody, that's a census. but they don't really count everyone. It's more of an estimate than anything else. The con of using a census, even though you'll always get your answer, you'll always get the parameter, it's time consuming, it's difficult, and it's also very costly because you have to be able to count every single person. And it takes a while. I mean, you think about the US, there's 300 million people in the US. Right there, you've got, it's going to take years to get those. And, what if you miss somebody? That type of stuff. Okay, so sampling is better. For this, it's taking a small subset of a larger population and then answering a question based on it. Okay, so the pro is that it's quicker, it's easier to gather your data, but the problem is that you do have interference on your conclusions because of different things. You have different bias and stuff. Okay, your target population is the population that you want to get your information from or to. Talking about a general election, you're going to be talking about the people that are voting. So the voters of a country, that would be your target population. Those are the people that you want to get it from. If I'm going to be asking questions about high schoolers, the high schoolers are the ones that I'm going to be asking the questions of. Okay, so target population is where you want to get your information from. Sampling frame is how you're going to shrink that population. So again, in the US, there are 300 million people. The population of people that could vote is probably about 200 million, approximately. And so that's one sampling frame. You've just shrunk it, but then you need less because still doing 200 million people is way too long to try to do that. So that's why we'd have to shrink it down even more. So it's what you're doing to shrink the population. Okay. So what are some frames that we could use for this? In previous elections, and anytime you see polling, you might see different ways that it's been done. Let's say we look at the 2004 congressional elections. Registered voters there was about 49% Democrats, 47% Republicans. So that's taking a population of people that could vote, shrinking down even more to just registered voters. And then you can shrink it down even further and go likely voters. So even though somebody is registered to vote, doesn't mean they will vote. Because not everybody uses their right to vote. They just choose not to. So that's why they also ask for likely voters, people that say, yes, I will vote this year, or I'm planning on voting. And as you see here, you've got a different split, 47% Democrat, 50% Republican in 2004. Okay. So which one of these two do you think would be closer to the actual results of an election if you take a poll from the first one of just registered voters or one of more likely voters? Okay, so take a second. Which one do you think would end up with a more realistic result? Well, in this case, it's probably going to be the likely voters, because likely voters means that they're planning on voting. Registered voters are not. So likely voters is probably going to be closer to the actual number. Okay. So again, likely voters are more likely. Okay, so literary disaster. So the Literary Digest, okay, as a magazine way back in the early 20th century. And so in their big thing around election times was always they tried to make a prediction who's going to win the election. And so in 1936, it was FDR against Landon, and they decided to go big. They had predicted, they were fairly good at predicting who was going to win the previous years, and so they decided to go big. They went 10 million people they were going to ask, okay? So they looked through the phone book, they went through their magazine subscriptions, they went through rosters of different clubs and associations, okay, so that people were a part of. They went through all these and they got a group of 10 million people, and they sent out information. Basically, they did this to get contact information. So sent it out, sent it to everyone to get what they wanted. Their result came back, FDR 43%, Landon 57%. Now, for those of you that know history and know about this, FDR actually won, and he won by a landslide, 62% to Landon's 38%. So you see here we have this huge difference in the results, and that was a problem. They'd never seen anything like this before. Why is it that we've had such a differing result? And so they basically had to look at why were they so far off. Now, part of it was the selection bias of it. So what a selection bias is built-in tendencies in which a certain group is either favored or not favored in selecting. So in this case, the people that were picked in 1936, what was going on? Think about what was going on in the 1930s. In the 1930s, we were in the middle of the Great Depression. People weren't living where they originally were living. People were moving. Not everybody had phones. It's 1930s. Not everybody's part of a club because they're moving because they don't have a job. And not everybody has a magazine subscription because they can't spend money on a leisure item. Okay, so because of all this stuff, how they were taking their data in, they were favoring more the rich people, people that weren't so harmed by the Great Depression. Next, we have our response rate. Out of the 10 million people that they wanted, they only got about 24% that responded back. So about 2.4 million people. So even though they asked 10 million people, less than a quarter of them replied to them. Okay, and so that's a non-response bias, or you might want to think of it as the silent majority. When the rate is real low on people's responses, you're going to miss some people. Okay, this is some people think about the 2016 election between Trump and Hillary. Even though Hillary was leading in all the polls, how is it that Trump ended up winning? And the main reason was because there was this non-response bias. There were people that refused to say who they were going to vote for because they didn't want people to know. They didn't want people to know that they were going to vote for Trump. And that's a bias that it's almost impossible to try to deal with, because if they don't respond to your poll, there's no way for you to know what they're going to do. Okay. All right. So this is the end of the first half of this section. This is going to continue in part 2.